For 33 years, the Hwaseong Serial Murders haunted South Korea, remaining one of the country's most infamous cold cases. Between 1986 and 1991, all the victims were women, ranging in age from 13 to 71. The investigation was one of the largest in South Korean history, involving 2.05 million officers and military personnel, and questioning more than 21,000 suspects. Countless DNA analyses and fingerprint examinations were conducted, yet the true culprit was never found. Despite these unprecedented efforts, the killer remained at large, and the investigation was terminated in 2006 due to the statute of limitations expiring. To everyone's surprise, the case saw a breakthrough in 2019, marking its closure. In a golden field of Hwaseong, Detective Park Do-man receives a report. He arrives at the scene and discovers a woman's body in a ditch. Such incidents are rare in this peaceful small town, leaving him somewhat bewildered. Park Do-man investigates in his usual manner, gathering everyone related to the case at a crossroad to look for clues. However, it is clear from the outset that he is not very skilled at analyzing evidence. Soon after, another murder occurs, with the perpetrator's methods eerily similar to the first. At the time, investigative resources are extremely limited. Forget fingerprinting or DNA analysis. Simply securing a crime scene is a challenge. Detective Park takes great pride in his investigative intuition, often referred to as his sharp eye. Sergeant Koo Hee-bong gives him a small test. Two men are sitting nearby, one a rapist and the other the brother of a victim. Park must identify the rapist. After a careful inspection, Detective Park is stumped. He then hears a lead from his girlfriend about a mentally challenged man named Kwang-ho, who was seen following one of the victims, Miss Lee. Detective Park quickly arrests Kwang-ho, and when talking man-to-man doesn't work, the police resort to violent interrogation to extract a confession. Brutal policing was likely common in small towns at the time, where petty criminals often confessed after a few punches and kicks. The two brutal murders attract nationwide attention, prompting a young detective from Seoul named Seo Tae-yoon to join the investigation. When Seo tries to ask a woman for directions, she panics and runs off, falling in the process. As Seo attempts to help her up, Detective Park arrives just in time, delivering a classic flying kick. Initially, Park mistakes Seo for the rapist, and the misunderstanding is cleared up with some bickering. Detective Park is convinced that Kwang-ho is the killer. He even fabricates evidence by creating a false footprint with Kwang-ho's shoe at the crime scene and takes photos as proof. The police and the suspect eat harmoniously together, but as soon as the fabricated evidence is printed, Detective Park begins to interrogate Kwang-ho. Detective Seo watches silently, curious to see what results their rough methods might yield. Kwang-ho is taken to the woods to reenact the crime. The detectives threaten him, demanding he recall Miss Lee's murder while they record his words. At first, Kwang-ho seems to remember and describes the crime in detail, but then he reverts to his mentally challenged state, which earns him a flying kick to the head. Detective Seo looks into the evidence again. Detective Park proudly announces that they have cracked the case based on a shaky voice recording and fabricated evidence. While photos are taken by news reporters, Detective Seo checks Kwang-ho's severely burnt hands from childhood, hands so damaged that he can't even properly hold chopsticks. The local detectives drag Kwang-ho to the crime scene, forcing him to reenact the murder in front of the public. Detective Seo reminds Sergeant Koo that Kwang-ho's severely burnt hands make it impossible for him to have tied up the victim so securely, but Sergeant Koo dismisses this. Kwang-ho's father shows up, screaming for his son's innocence, triggering Kwang-ho to fight back. The announcement doesn't go as planned, and the local detectives' methods are exposed. Despite genuinely wanting to solve the case, Park's rough methods reflect the norm of the time. After the false capture news is released, Sergeant Shin Dong-chul takes charge of the case. While Detective Park briefs Sergeant Shin, he discovers new information he hadn't known before. Semen and blood from the serial killer were found at the crime scenes. The team revisits the first crime scene. Detective Seo analyzes the previous cases and notices a pattern. The victims were all wearing red and were murdered on rainy days. On a rainy day, a recent missing persons report reveals another female's name, leading Seo to deduce there may be an undiscovered victim. Seo is certain of this and guarantees to find her within 2 days. Not seeing eye to eye with Detective Seo, Detective Park and his colleague sit out the search. After an afternoon of searching, the team finds a third victim, murdered in the same manner. One evening, Detective Park and his colleagues dine at Kwang Ho's family's restaurant. As a gesture of goodwill, Park even buys Kwang Ho a new pair of shoes. After dinner, the group goes out for some fun. Detective Park and Detective Seo get into a heated argument over their contrasting approaches. Sergeant Shin suggests a new plan: have a female officer wear a red dress and walk outside in the rain, hoping to lure the killer. They wait in vain. The killer never shows. The crime team hears a rumor from students that the killer lives near the school, where a woman's scream is sometimes heard. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, a woman is walking and singing when she hears someone whistling along. Panicked, she runs, but is ultimately caught by the killer. A new clue soon emerges. A female officer discovers that before each murder, a particular song was always requested on the radio. They call the radio station, only to learn that the postcard with the request had been discarded by the staff. Detective Park believes the lack of hair at the crime scenes indicates the killer might be hairless down there, leading him to frequent public bathhouses, scrutinizing other men's private areas. One night, both detectives return to the crime scene, searching for more clues. Suddenly, they spot a strange man laying out white lingerie and masturbating while wearing red underwear. At last, they have a suspect. A high-intensity chase ensues, leading them to a factory where all the workers wear identical uniforms and masks, making identification difficult. Detective Park sees this opportunity and tricks the suspect into revealing himself by pretending to spot him through his so-called sharp eye. But once again, they are disappointed. The suspect is just a perverted man with no real connection to the murders. Their aggressive interrogation techniques fail to yield any solid evidence, and the detectives are left frustrated. Detective Seo consults the female student from that rainy day and learns more about the rumor mentioned earlier. He helps her with a bandage for a sports injury on her back. They turn to a new lead, a mentally unstable woman, the only one who escaped during the attack. She recalls the killer having soft, delicate hands. Detective Seo examines the factory workers' hands, but they are rough and scarred, clearly not those of the killer. Another female body is found, and this time, the killer leaves chunks of peach inside the victim. Detective Park feels increasingly hopeless. A new clue emerges. The radio station kept recent postcards sent for song requests made on the same days as the murders. By tracking down the address on one of the postcards, the detectives bring in Park Hyeon-gyu, the third suspect. Park Hyeon-gyu's hands are delicate and soft, and he arrived in town just before the bodies started appearing. Park Hyeon-gyu's continued denial earns him a flying kick from Detective Cho. With the public closely watching the case, Sergeant Shin reminds Detective Cho again not to resort to violence. Detectives listen to Kwang Ho's forest recording again and conclude that only a witness could describe the crime in such detail. They immediately ask Kwang Ho if he can identify Park Hyeon-gyu as the killer. Kwang Ho panics and runs off along the train tracks. The only potential witness is gone. Forensics found the killer's DNA on the recent victim, But most countries at the time lack experience with DNA comparison techniques, so they must send it to a US DNA lab. The process involves paperwork and a long wait. Detective Seo, who has been watching Park Hyeon-gyu, becomes increasingly worried after losing sight of the third suspect. Though Sergeant Shin reminds him that it's only a matter of time before the DNA results come back, Seo remains on edge. That same night, the killer strikes again, placing the schoolgirl's stationery on the ground. Her body is discovered the next day in the woods. Forensics finds the stationery inside her body and peels off the bandage on her back. Detective Seo recognizes the schoolgirl. Driven by his suspicions, Detective Seo drags Park Hyeon-gyu to a secluded tunnel along the train tracks and beats him, seemingly convinced that he is the killer. Seo holds Park at gunpoint, ready to pull the trigger. Detective Park arrives with the results from the US DNA lab. Detective Seo eagerly reads them, only to learn that the DNA does not match Park Hyeon-gyu. Pushed to the brink of madness, Seo abandons his scientific principles, consumed by rage and frustration. Detective Park, surprisingly calm and rational, stops Seo from shooting. Park Hyeon-gyu escapes, disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving the truth shrouded in mystery. Years pass, and Detective Park has left the police force, now working as a salesman. The unsolved case seems forgotten. By chance, he travels to Hwaseong for a delivery. In a golden field, Park revisits the site where the first body was found. As he reflects on the past, a young girl passes by and mentions that someone else was there recently, trying to recall what happened at that very spot. This sparks Park's memory, and he asks what the man looked like. The young girl describes him as an ordinary-looking man. Park turns, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and helplessness. Perhaps the killer is among the audience. For upcoming content, click like, pound that subscribe, and hit notification. Thank you for watching.